first we heard was, some men over in London had an interesting idea. As a gesture of goodwill, they planned to reproduce the original Mayflower and sail her to America loaded with chests of British goods, leaving the ship as a gift, of course. This unique tribute to the Pilgrim fathers and mothers was conceived by 37-year-old Warwick Charlton, a one-time British Army officer who had served with Montgomery in Africa.
The idea to rebuild the Mayflower first occurred to me during the war when I was serving with our American allies. A lot of people thought then, as they do now, that there was nothing so important in peace as in war as the Anglo-American alliance. The Mayflower seemed to me to symbolize a bond, a community of interest, a determination to preserve freedom. But what could one man, one individual do to make that dream come true? I was determined to try, and after the war I began to enlist support. But I must admit it was a very disappointing experience, at least at first. One night I was taken to a cocktail party by a friend. I'd never met my host, and it was quite by chance I found myself talking to him. I soon found that he had a taste for adventure, and that was how I raised the first money for the Mayflower project, from Felix Fenston, self-made millionaire, yachtsman and sportsman.
Mayflower II was built at Brixham. As construction got underway, her hull resembled the bone structure of some prehistoric creature, but the bones are solid beams of Devon oak, hewn by hand and shaped by artisans using 17th century tools of their forefathers. The greatest living expert on Mayflower is the man who designed her, the American naval architect, William A. Baker.
You would think from all that has been written about the Pilgrim Fathers that there would be a wealth of information about the Mayflower. Believe me, there isn't. She was just a typical 17th century merchant ship, and nobody bothered to record her dimensions or measurements.
But let's just say that the evidence was that she was a typical three-masted, square-rigged ship of the period, with a keel of 58 foot, a breadth of 25 feet, and a depth of 12 foot 6 inches.
It took Baker 6 years to work out his plans, and he can give you a reason for each detail. For instance, the wooden tree nails, the British call them trunnels, which fasten the planks to the frames. They were made from Devon cider casks more than 100 years old. Newer wood might have shrunk. In fact, everyone who saw Mayflower being built was impressed with the fine craftsmanship of her builders. Here was a vessel that would last for another 300 years. On September 22nd, 1956, in a driving downpour, the second Mayflower was launched from Stuart Upham's shipyard and slipped into the waters of the harbor.
We began to receive letters, cables, phone calls, all from people who wanted to sail on Mayflower. Until one day, we received a letter which we like to think was the most important we received then or since. It was signed by Commander Alan Villiers.
We couldn't have chosen a better skipper. An Australian, born and bred in sail, Villiers knows as much, perhaps, about square riggers as any man afloat. At 19, he was whaling in the Antarctic. He has pushed square canvas around the world. Mayflower's canvas was made of flax and hand-sewn by the same Scottish firm that has been providing sails for British ships since the days of George III. Her 80-foot main pole, in fact, all her masts and spars are built of Oregon pine. It was sailing ships like this that opened up the world, found new continents, and maintained much of the world's commerce up to the 19th century. Yet, with all the skill of her builders and her master, many a waterfront skeptic said Mayflower would not make it. For them, Captain Villiers had an answer.
I must say I've been getting a bit fed up with these pessimistic utterances I've seen in sundry newspapers, that the masts lean the wrong way and that the ship is, well, she'll never make it. I don't believe in that at all. That's a fine little ship, and I'm sure if any of the Pilgrim Fathers walked into this dock right now, they'd know that ship. They might be surprised when they went on board because there's good headroom and there's a good galley, because we've fixed up things as well as we can. But I'm sure that they would have the utmost confidence in the ship the same as I have. And within a few days from now, I hope to be sailing in the track of the Pilgrim Fathers.
British merchants had confidence in her, too. They loaded aboard Mayflower 92 treasure chests with $250,000 worth of British-made goods consigned to America. After many irritating delays, we were towed out of Brixham Harbor for sea trials. I must say that my own first impression of Mayflower was anything but reassuring. I had seen nothing like her outside of history books. On the tow to Plymouth, nobody noticed that the tug was pulling us down by the bow so that a constant stream was coming in through the hawse pipes. We had nearly a foot of water sloshing around 'tween decks. To the citizens of Plymouth, as elsewhere in England, the name Mayflower means every bit as much as it does to us in America. For they recall that epic voyage as the great adventure that gave free people a new birthright, a new sense of democracy, justice, and religious freedom. A voyage which forged the longest-lasting bond of friendship in all history, the bond between England and America. The Lord Mayor held a ceremony at Mayflower Steps. This is the landing stage from which history says the Pilgrims made their actual departure. Our crew numbered 33 men, including Captain Villiers, and we were crowded. The first Mayflower carried more than 100 passengers alone, but this time we were the only Pilgrims. We embarked on our mission of goodwill with high spirits and a keen sense of adventure. What lay ahead, none of us knew, but we were all for it. The original Pilgrims set sail with far less assurance of reaching port than we had. William Bradford, the governor of the first colony, wrote, "What drove them west was a great hope and inward zeal they had of laying some good foundation for propagating and advancing the gospel of the kingdom of Christ in those remote parts." With such ideals, men rarely fail. Captain Villiers' original plan was to take the short northern route to America. Nobody knows exactly what course the Pilgrims followed. Our problem on leaving England was simply to get to sea and find a favorable wind. One came from the north and blew us southward. So south we went, all the way to the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa. From there we turned west, blown steadily across the Atlantic by the northeast trades. You get to know a sailing ship by taking a turn at the wheel. We soon learned that trying to keep Mayflower on course in anything but light weather was a hard job for the helmsman. Just to keep in tradition, Godfrey Wicksteed, our first mate, would try and fix our position with a 17th century crossstaff, the forerunner of the modern sextant. In those days, this was the last word in navigational equipment. On Sundays, we gathered on the quarterdeck while the skipper read alternately from the Bible and from Bradford's Plymouth history. With deference to the desire for religious freedom that sparked the initial voyage, no man was forced to attend services. However, very few missed them, for here Villiers, the author and adventurer, was in his element. Through his eloquent, informal talks, we soon came to have a keener appreciation and a deeper understanding of those who had sailed so many years before us, of the part the first Mayflower played in establishing the principles of freedom in the New World. Mastering Mayflower's complex sails and memorizing the location and use of her more than 50 different ropes was not easy. Stuart Upham, who built the ship, worked right along with the rest of the crew. Adrian Small, our second mate, was only 28, yet he was reputed to hold the Merchant Navy's last square rig certificate. He also possessed the most ticklish beard on board. awfully tired a salt horse. But Wally Godfrey, ship's cook, managed to keep us well fed despite primitive conditions in the galley. We had no refrigeration, limited supplies of fresh water, and a temperamental paraffin stove. The ship was worked day in and day out by 3 watches of 4 men each. Twice a day, each man took a 1-hour trick at the wheel. These soon became a chore because Mayflower had only one mood. She did not want to stay on course. At night came an hour's duty as lookout. This was a time when your imagination ran riot and you'd think of Algerian corsairs and Spanish galleons, the whole procession of square riggers that had gone before. Keeping that old Brixham bell polished was almost as much of a chore as the letter stamping detail. Mayflower carried 140,000 pieces of philatelic mail that had to be stamped by hand. We all hoped that the president would appreciate the one addressed to the White House. After 2 weeks, we turned the corner on our southerly route and headed westward toward America. Then, to our dismay, the dependable trade wind began to falter. Soon we were becalmed in a very lonely part of the world. Weeks went by without our seeing a smudge of smoke on the horizon. Anxiously, we would look aloft. One day we made a scant 11 miles. These were dog days, and it was hot. The romance of the voyage had evaporated with the wind. Felix the Stowaway, who grew en route from kitten to full-size cat, was an interested spectator as we prepared a message to be tossed into the sea in a bottle. All hands signed a paper with instructions that the finder should return same to Dick Brennan, our second cook, in care of the establishment he owns, London's popular Wig and Pen Club. We guarantee Dick will provide the finder with a meal on the house. Just as the curse of the albatross was lifted at last from the ship of the ancient mariner, the breeze picked up, and once again we were plowing along, making more than 100 miles a day. We soon had our first glimpse of civilization as the French liner Colombe overhauled us. Our skipper may have thought he was giving his passengers a rare treat by circling our ship, but he couldn't have known what that glimpse of luxury and pretty women passengers meant to men then 6 weeks at sea. One ceremony we all enjoyed was young Joe Meany's graduation exercise. Joe, our 17-year-old American cabin boy, was heartbroken because he was unable to graduate from high school with his classmates. So our captain and the crew staged a graduation Joe will never forget. An elaborate diploma was unrolled and read by the captain. Then Joe was clothed in a handsome graduation gown made from a couple of old bed sheets. The mortarboard was fashioned from a golf cap and a mop. The finest sheepskin couldn't have made Joe any happier. We must have presented an unusual sight to the Navy PBY that buzzed us off Bermuda. United States destroyers bound for Hampton Roads raced by with a full-dress salute. One of them stood by long enough to send over some very welcome fresh provisions. Helicopter hovered near us, Mayflower's crew got its biggest thrill of the voyage as HMS Ark Royal came over the horizon. 10 times our length, the 36,000-ton aircraft carrier steamed past at top speed, her decks bristling with warplanes, the fourth great ship of the line to bear that illustrious name. With Mayflower well into American waters, we were getting more and more impatient to reach our destination. But we had all kinds of weather during those last few days, and not all of it was kind to us. With scarcely 200 miles to go, we ran into the most severe storm of the voyage. All hands turned to as the wind reached force 8. This means gale. Men working aloft had to remember the old maxim, one hand for the ship, one hand for yourself. We were hove to for a day while the storm blew itself out. The next day, our tiny speck was sighted by the waiting American press. When we made Nantucket Lightship, our radio was crackling. Here, at the Times Square of Atlantic liners, we felt we were home. Town, with its classic Gothic monument standing at the tip of Cape Cod, is where the Pilgrims first touched American soil. We anchored in the same harbor that sheltered the first Pilgrims for 4.5 weeks. Here we reenacted the signing of the Mayflower Compact. This pact, which established that laws would be made for the common good, was the first voice of the people, one of America's first documents of democracy. At Plymouth, 24 miles across the bay, stands the legendary Rock, the landmark that has become one of the great shrines of American history. The morning of our scheduled arrival, crowds began flocking to the waterfront, eager for the first glimpse of our sails. Special stands had been built on Coles Hill overlooking the harbor. Thus we began the last leg of our adventure. On June 13th, 1957, 54 days out of Plymouth, England, we made port at Plymouth, Massachusetts. The long voyage was over. We had been at sea for nearly 2 months, 14 days less than it took the original Pilgrims. We had sailed 5,435 miles. A crew of local Pilgrims, dressed for the occasion, put out to greet us in a well-made 8-oared shallop. This, too, is an exact replica of Mayflower's original longboat, from which the first colonists are reputed to have stepped ashore onto Plymouth Rock. adjoining shallop went Captain Villiers, Warwick Charlton, and Joe Meany, the American cabin boy. We made shore amid a blizzard of cheers, ship's whistles, airplanes, and helicopters buzzing overhead. Quite a contrast to what that grim first landing must have been 337 years before. Garbed in the traditional costume of the period, knee breeches, buckled shoes, and peaked hats, the crew, led by Commander Villiers, was drummed ashore for the welcome ceremony. Brewster, descendant of the colony's first spiritual leader, was among those to wish all hands congratulations upon a safe voyage. For Joe Meany's mother, it was one of those rare moments of relief mingled with pride and satisfaction. Her son, chosen from among all the boys' clubs in America, had acquitted himself well. Mrs. Meany was just glad to have him safely home. While this was their moment of glory, the thoughts uppermost in the minds of most of the crew were, where can we get a shower bath, and where can we get a good, thick steak? Next day, Mayflower was moved from her mooring offshore to the town dock to discharge cargo. Overhead was just as strange a sight alongside Mayflower as were the modern transcontinental moving vans on hand to speed Mayflower's treasure chests across the country. Weighing 400 to 500 pounds each, packed with prize silver, snuff boxes, toilet soap, shoes, biscuits, woolens, it's a much different cargo from the timber, tar, and salt herring the original Mayflower once carried between Norway and France. One chest, consigned to the British ambassador in Washington, contained gifts for the White House. Others held antique tables and a half-dozen Bibles especially printed for the governors of the 6 New England states. As the cargo master sends the first van on its way, the story of Mayflower's epic voyage comes to an end. Yet the men who brought the ship over will never forget their experience. Perhaps it will serve to remind all Americans of the ideals and principles which have made the first Mayflower story an inspiration for more than 300 years.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.